Well, thank you for that enthusiastic introduction. Rod made it kind of sound sort of spiritual that I'm preaching this morning. I realize now why he invited me to preach this morning. It's because their boss is here, and they were like, since our boss is here, we could have somebody else preach, and that would be okay. And so, if I was in your shoes, I'd do the same thing. So, be like, you guys. We're going to be talking this morning about how not to pray. And so we're going to be talking about some of Jesus' warnings directly preceding the Lord's Prayer about some of the pitfalls of how people pray and how, we shouldn't pray. And so in light of that, let's start with prayer, right? That's probably a good idea. Jesus, we are so thankful, Lord, for who you are, because, oh boy, we are not that. You are just everything that we need, everything that we want. Lord, be here, and regardless of anything that we say or do, it's my request, Lord, that we would see you, understand you better, grow closer to you. And Lord, if that means that nobody hears anything that I say, that's probably not a bad thing. So, Lord, just do that. In Jesus' name, amen. So we're going to be talking about how not to pray. If you want to jump to Matthew chapter 6, those are the verses that we're going to be working with today, Matthew 6, verse 1 through 8. But prior to that, we're going to be talking about the background of Matthew a little bit. If you know me at all, I'm going to talk about background stuff, so just get ready for your history lesson. And then we're going to talk about two specific mistakes. The two specific mistakes are the mistake of the hypocrite, which is misusing others, and the mistake of the Gentile, which is misusing God. So those are the two mistakes. And I'm done. We can all go home, right? No, we're going to elaborate on that a little bit. But let's talk about the background of Matthew really quick. Here's a sort of a puzzling quotation in Matthew that gives you an idea of how you ought to read Matthew. This tells you how Matthew understands the Bible. And in Matthew chapter 2, verse 15, he says, "This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, 'Out of Egypt I have called my son.'" Now what he's saying here is when Jesus had gone down to Egypt with his family, and Jesus is now leaving Egypt with his family. Okay, and he says, this is a fulfillment of prophecy. If you're familiar at all with Matthew, he says that all the time. Like every other verse is, this happened so it would be fulfilled as it was written, Old Testament quotation. That's Matthew, just every other verse, okay? Well, the interesting thing about this is if you look up this verse in the Old Testament, it's in Hosea 11:1. It says, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." And so you read that in Hosea, and then you read it in Matthew, and then you go back to Hosea, and then you go back to Matthew, and you're like, Matthew, that ain't talking about Jesus. That's talking about Israel. And Matthew's like, yeah, but really it's actually talking about Jesus. It is. And so the question we have to ask is, how can Matthew actually use this quotation without using the Bible out of context, right? That's the thing we always tell people, never to use the Bible out of context, right? And here, Matthew seems to be taking the Bible out of context. So why is he doing that? Why does he feel comfortable doing that? The reason for that is that in Matthew's mind, Jesus is the fulfillment of everything that Israel did. So when they fail, he succeeds. Everything that Israel does, Jesus also has to do. So let's look at a couple of examples of this. So here's a brief glimpse of Israel's life in the Pentateuch. Israel goes to Egypt, children are killed, Israel leaves Egypt, Israel goes through the water. After the water, they enter the wilderness, and in the wilderness, they fail several times, and these failures are discussed in Deuteronomy 6 and 8. Okay, so that's just a brief, there's obviously more in the Pentateuch, but those are just a couple of the high points, okay? Let's look at what Matthew says about Jesus' life. Jesus goes to Egypt. Well, there's an interesting parallel. Children are killed. Another interesting parallel. Jesus leaves Egypt. Interesting parallel. Jesus' departure of Egypt is punctuated by his baptism, right? Israel goes through the water, Jesus goes through the water. Okay? After Israel goes through the water, they go into the wilderness. After Jesus goes through the water, he goes into the wilderness. There's a pretty clear parallel in Matthew here that everything that happens to Israel has to also happen to Jesus. Now, this is a really important way to read Matthew. This is Matthew's intention with his gospel. He's lining this up so that when we read what's happening in the gospel, we're thinking of what happened to Israel. And notice particularly in the wilderness, all of Israel's failures in the wilderness are brought back up in Jesus' temptation. It's really interesting to read Jesus' temptation and look at the quotations in the Old Testament, because what's happening is Satan is trying to get Jesus to fail the same way that Israel failed. And Jesus quotes specific verses from the Old Testament that are actually the rebukes of Israel's failure. So Jesus actually says, I know that trick that you tried and it succeeded on them. But remember when I said they shouldn't do that? Yeah, I'm not going to do that. Those are his quotations in his temptation. I know you're all thinking, this is all great. What does that have to do with prayer, right? I'm kind of off on a big tangent here because I like to talk, and that's just what's going to happen. I tried to make you laugh so I'd have time to drink some water. It worked. Yay. So the reason that this is important is because at this stage in Matthew, he's established that Jesus is Israel, right? In a way, right? We could unpack that statement and it'd take years to unpack what we mean by that, but just if you can follow along with me here. He's unpacked that idea to some degree. What happens next in Israel's life? Big event that happens next in Israel's life. Moses goes up on Sinai, and then he gives the law. Or, if we want to rephrase it, he goes up on a mountain, and he gives a sermon. Right? What happens next in Matthew? The Sermon on the Mount. The exact same thing, right? The next step in Matthew showing that Jesus is fulfilling everything that happened in the life of Israel. The next step is Jesus going up on a mountain and telling Israel how they ought to interact with God, right? That is exactly what Moses did. That's exactly now what Jesus is doing. It's really important that when we read the Sermon on the Mount that we actually get what's happening there in comparison to what's happening in the Old Testament. One of the interesting things there is if you look at when Moses gave the law in the Old Testament, one of the things that the Israelites said to him was, you know, mountain looks kind of scary, smoky God up there, weird. How about you go talk to him and we'll stay here and you can just tell us what he says, right? And Moses is like, but really though, that's a bad idea. And they're like, but really though, that's what we're going to do, right? That's our plan. That's what we're going to do. Now, in contrast to that, Jesus here doesn't even give them that opportunity. When he talks to them about prayer, and we're going to see this in a second, but I want you to get this point. If you get no other point, this is what I want you to get. Jesus doesn't even give them that opportunity. For Jesus, prayer is, it's not even an opportunity that you would say, you do the prayer for me, and then just let me know how it worked. Let me know how it happened. That's not even an option. For him, you're talking to your Father. How does the Lord's Prayer start? Our Father. This is not a distant deity that someone else is going to go talk to for you. This is your Father. And so the biggest point in prayer is that you ought to do it because it's your dad. Now I get sometimes dad conjures up bad memories, or in my case, no memories. I didn't have a dad. And so that's difficult. But that's something that we have to work through in the context of community, that we learn the positive implications of that word. Well, let's look and see what Jesus actually says about prayer. I'm actually going to get to, that was all intro. All intro. You're welcome. So let's get to Jesus as Moses. Okay. We're going to start in verse 1. Beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them. For then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. Now, I don't know Spanish well enough to add the italics in the Spanish. So if you know Spanish, just you figure that out on your own, sorry. But notice that he doesn't say, beware of practicing your righteousness because you don't have any. He actually assumes that you can actually practice your righteousness. And that when you practice your righteousness, you need to make sure that you're not doing it for the purposes of other people seeing it. And that's a point that we need to actually get, that it's not just this, well, I don't have righteousness. Well, what righteousness is not a static notion. We all think, since the Reformation, we all think righteousness is right standing before God. If you look at the Old Testament background of the word righteousness, it's actually action, always. It's righteous deeds. God's action in the universe. That's what righteousness is, the righteousness of God. It's His action in the universe. And so righteousness here is positive action. Beware of practicing your positive action so that other people can see it. He doesn't say don't practice your positive action. Don't do it so that other people can see it, with the purpose of them seeing it, right? Verse 2, thus when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. Again, truly I say to you, they have received their reward. It's interesting here that he says, sound no trumpet, because the collection plate of sorts in the synagogue was actually sort of the shape of a trumpet. And so what he's talking about here is kind of throwing your money in there to make it loud, so that people are like, who made that noise? Wow, that was really loud. That was a lot of money, right? They don't know you just threw a bunch of rocks in there, right, to make a bunch of noise. But that's what he's saying. He's like, don't sound that, put it in there and don't worry about what other people have to say. Don't worry about what other people have to think, right? What does this have to do with prayer, right? We're getting there. Hold on. In verse 3, when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, which is what I'm doing right now. Left hand's in the pocket. That was unintentional. I just noticed it. So that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And this is when we get to prayer. Verse 5. And when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, that they may be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. I want you to notice something here. What kind of prayer is this? These people have received a reward for this prayer by other people seeing them. That means that they're not actually praying for something, right? They're not like, God, give me this thing, right? This is actually just talking to Jesus. This isn't, God, I need this, give me this. Because Jesus isn't saying, they've asked for this, and I'm not going to give it to them because people heard them. Right? That doesn't make sense here. What he's saying is that they're actually just out there talking to Jesus, trying to make a show of things that other people would hear what they're saying. And Jesus is like, yeah, the benefit of all of that, they've already received. Because they're more concerned with their reputation among men than they are with their relationship with me. So they've already received what they want. I granted their prayer. They have a better reputation with people. They don't care about their relationship with me. Right? That's the mistake of the hypocrite. Let's notice what Jesus says in the next verse, verse 6. But when you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Now, this has been, in my opinion, misunderstood. You can disagree with me if you would like. What we have to recognize is that they don't have houses like we have. So it's not like they have a four bedroom, three bathroom house that like they have all these closets and they're like, well, which one of the closets is the prayer closet, right? They don't have that. If you look at houses for what they would have lived in, there aren't really rooms like that for most of them. And what I think is going on here, and you can disagree with me if you would like, I think Jesus is being kind of sarcastic. It may rattle your cage a little bit that Jesus is being sarcastic, that sarcasm is bad. No, it's not. There's plenty of sarcasm in the Bible. If you want to talk about that later, we can. Read the prophets or Proverbs a lot, actually, even. Amos is incredibly sarcastic, and it's really just beautiful. Because I'm sarcastic a lot, and I just love it. But what I think Jesus is doing here is being kind of sarcastic, because the people he's talking to are the people that want a reputation. Who are the people that want a reputation? Who are the people that are most concerned about what other people think about them? Most of the time, rich people. Because when you're poor, you don't have the time to worry about what other people think about you, right? You've got to figure out where food's coming from. If you've got the luxury to be concerned with what other people think about you, you're probably pretty well off, at least in this culture. And so it seems to me that Jesus is being kind of sarcastic to these people. He's like, if you're so concerned about what people think of you, go to your giant house and find one of the rooms there and pray in that room, right? Don't go out here and try to get everybody's attention. Go back to your rich house and find a room there and pray in that. That's what I would like you to do. And Jesus' application here is you need to stop praying publicly because you're so excited about people hearing you pray publicly. You need to find somewhere private and get right with me. Now, for most people, this doesn't apply because they don't have that room, right? The reason I think this has been misunderstood is we tend to take this to say that we should always pray in private, we should never pray in public, except that the Bible records all sorts of public prayers. Jesus prays publicly, the prophets pray publicly. That happens regularly. So it can't mean that. It can't mean that we can't pray publicly. What it has to mean is this is a corrective to the people that are making that mistake. That Jesus is saying that if you're making this kind of mistake, this is what you should do to make up for it. So the mistake of the hypocrite is that the hypocrite wants attention. The hypocrite is trying to misuse other people for their own well-being, right? Trying to buffer up my self-image by other people liking me. If other people will just like me, then maybe I can like myself. Notice God is nowhere in that equation. It's completely misunderstood the purpose of prayer. The purpose of prayer being that you're talking to your Father who loves you, and that's where your self-image should come from, right? If you're talking to Him on a regular basis, you have a thriving relationship with Him, then it doesn't matter if other people think you're stupid. It just doesn't. Because you're happy with what He thinks about you. That's the mistake of the hypocrite. The hypocrite's trying to use other people for their self-image. If you're the hypocrite, stop. Right? Stop doing that. Stop worrying about that. Seriously, though. If you're not the hypocrite, you need to rejoice for a moment that you're not making that mistake. There's so many of us that think, I don't want to pray publicly because I don't know the right words. I'm going to sound stupid, right? That's actually the opposite mistake of the hypocrite. The hypocrite's saying, I want to pray publicly because I want people to think that I'm smart. The other person says, I don't want to pray publicly because I don't want people to think I'm stupid. Stop, right? Don't do that. So the hypocrite needs to go find a prayer closet, and they need to get right with Jesus. They need to realize that other people's opinion of them doesn't matter. And the person who's avoiding that pitfall needs to get out of their prayer closet. Stepping on some toes here, I'm sorry. You need to pray publicly. We need your voice. We need, I preached a month or two or three. I have really bad sense of time. It was a while ago. I cried a lot. It was terrible. We talked about lamenting. We talked about how life isn't always pretty. We need that voice. And the people who are afraid of saying things publicly are robbing us of that voice. We need that voice. So we need to avoid the mistake of the hypocrite on either side. Let's look at the next mistake that you can make. Verse 7, and when you pray, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think that they will be heard for their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask Him. See, the hypocrite is trying to manipulate people for their own self-worth. The Gentile is trying to manipulate God. The Gentile thinks if I just say this and this and this, God has to respond. He has to. Well, no, He doesn't. And we could get into the theological ramifications of that, and that would be a really long conversation. We have to change our perspective about prayer from this, talking about the Gentile here, from this equation mentality to a relationship mentality. My wife loves me. And if I ask her, honey, can you please make me a sandwich? There's a really, really, really good chance she's going to do that. But she doesn't have to just because she loves me, right? She doesn't have to. If I approach my relationship with her as a have to, I'm going to break that relationship. If I approach my relationship with her and say, you're my wife, you better do this. Well, soon she will not be my wife anymore and she will not have to do that, right? But we approach our relationship with God that way. God, if I say this, you have to respond. Excuse me? Read Job. When Job gets disrespectful with God and God responds, says, brace yourself like a man. Essentially, we're going to have a very frank conversation and you're not going to like it. We need to be careful it's not we need to be careful because we need to be afraid of God, right? We just need to treat the relationship as though it were a relationship. That's the problem here. That's what the Gentiles doing. They want a guaranteed result, even if it means manipulating God. They think, there's some sort of mathematical formula, A plus B equals C. If I can just get this formula correct, then I'll get the right answer. I'll get the response. God's not there. God's not in that statement at all. That's a problem. We have to avoid that. Here's my question to you, those of you who are Gentiles. We're actually all Gentiles, but for the sake of the sermon, those of us who fall in this pitfall, here's my question for you. Who are you praying to? Are you praying to a force, or are you praying to a father? If you're praying to a force, then you need to get the words right. You need to pray the right amount of words. You have all these hoops you have to jump through, right? Because you're trying to make the force do something for you. The force be with you, right? If you're praying to a father, you're praying to someone who actually cares about you and actually wants to hear what you have to say and actually, shock and awe, wants to intervene on your behalf in your life. You don't need to manipulate him to make him want to do that. He already wants to do that. He wanted to do that before you even got in the relationship with him. That's why he let you get in the relationship with him, right? There's this point here that Jesus makes. He says, you don't need to pray all of these words because your Father knows before you even pray it. And so what do we think? We think, well, if God already knows, why do I even pray? Right? He knows. Why don't he just do it? Is that a relationship? It's not. Again, we've taken God out of the equation, really. If he knows so much, he should just do it. Let me just tell you something, okay? Personally, I grew up without a father. So the dad thing has been a very strange thing for me my whole life. I am a father now. My son can't talk yet, though he thinks he can. He just makes a bunch of noise. And can I tell you, that is the most beautiful noise in the world. There's nothing that I want to hear more than my little boy going, dad, 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 good, 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 good. He has no idea he's just making noise because he likes to hear himself talk because he is my son. Right? He just likes the noise. But that's beautiful to me. Even when there's no meaning in it, it's beautiful to me. How much more does your Heavenly Father want to hear your noise? Just anything you have to say. Well, the grass sure is green. He's happy to hear that. Of course he knows it's green. He created green, right? But he just wants to hear you talk to him. See, this is the radical difference between what Moses was dealing with and what Jesus is trying to get the Israelites to understand. They're saying, go to that big scary mountain over there. We don't want to talk to him. And Jesus is like, but he's your dad. He so wants to talk to you. So wants to talk to you at every moment of the day. We read later in the New Testament, pray without ceasing. And people are like, well, how on earth does that work? Right? I can't do anything without ceasing, short of perhaps making mistakes. So how does that work? Praying without ceasing is cultivating a mentality that you know that God's actually there all the time. So that at any moment in the day, you don't have to do something special to start praying. At any moment of the day, you know God's actually there listening to you, and so you can just start talking to Him. There's no magic formula or ritual that you have to do to get into prayer. You can be in prayer your entire life, and you really are in prayer your entire life, you're just not aware of it, because God's always there listening. You just have to talk. And sometimes, perhaps, listen. That would probably be good as well, right? One-sided conversations are usually bad. That's the thing. Is we have to change our perspective of prayer. The best example in my mind is Elijah and the prophets of Baal in the Old Testament. It's in 1 Kings, I think, chapter 18. We don't have to go there. You probably know the story, right? Elijah's a prophet of Yahweh. And the prophets of Baal are prophets of Baal. Shock and awe, right? That's a little on the nose. And they get into a battle over a deity. And the prophets of Baal are like, Baal is truly God. And Elijah's like, no, not really. And they're like, well, we'll prove it. And Elijah's like, cool, you have fun with that. And so they go and they cut themselves and they scream and they yell and they do all this sorts of stuff to try to get their deity's attention. And it doesn't work. And so they do it again. It doesn't work. And then Elijah essentially says, hey, thanks. There's no manipulation on his part. He doesn't have to get God's attention. He already has God's attention. And so do you. We have to change the way that we look at prayer. God is always listening. How often are we talking? How often are we taking advantage of that? So if you want to break up into groups and talk about this, think about this, or talk about how bad the sermon was, whatever you're going to talk about, it doesn't matter to me. I'm not going to be checking up on you, but God will. So the question is, who are you? Are you the hypocrite or are you the Gentile? And within that, what's one thing that you can change, or two things, or three things, whatever, that will help you avoid these two mistakes as you dialogue with our Father in heaven? Okay, so let's break up and talk about that.